Welcome to Shenandoah Valley Pottery in 19th century Maryland. My name is Allison and I work for St. Mary's County Library. So our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. And as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can use the chat if you prefer. So we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I'll do the share thing here. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Good to see your smiling faces again. This is going to be the last presentation for next couple of months. We start up again in September. So before we begin, I thought I'd start just tell you what's been going on with me professionally. We've been working on a site west of Waldorf in Charles County, where we have what looks like about a 5,000-year-old Native American site, single component. We've been getting some interesting stuff out of it, so hopefully I'll be talking about that in the autumn. Okay, so let's get going. So Western Maryland pottery, Shenandoah Valley pottery, Great Valley pottery, all of the same sort of thing. And so I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the kinds of pottery that they were making in that part of the state, and then what we've been seeing archaeologically. So pottery making in the Great Valley. Well, what's the Great Valley? The Great Valley is like a really big valley. It runs down through central Pennsylvania, through western Maryland, and down to Virginia into North Carolina. It's an area, and if you could see the image on the right-hand side is sort of a typical view of that area. It's great farmland. There's a lot of limestone out there, so you've got sweet soil, growing all sorts of field crops, lots of dairy. It's been an area that was, after the 7 Years' War, by the 1760s, a lot of folks, European settlers, started moving west into that area, and particularly a lot of Germans, a lot of Swiss Mennonites. So the area has a distinctly kind of German flavor to it. There are a number of potteries that were established starting in the 1760s and on and through the 19th century. And most of them were folks of German background. One of the earliest, if not the earliest, was the Weiss pottery. And at the Weiss pottery, a number of people worked who subsequently went and established their own potteries. And so the kinds of pots they were making for the Weiss family, for John Weiss, those styles kind of permeated the area. So there's a distinct similarity amongst products of the different pottery sites. The black and white images show you some of the kind of rim profiles we typically see on these locally made pots. And on the right-hand side are the slip decorated red earthenwares. All of this stuff initially was red earthenware. Eventually they got into making stonewares, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But just sort of kind of squiggly line decorations in slip. Occasionally you'll see some zoomorphic figures like a rooster and that sort of thing, but lots of lines and hatches, and we'll see a couple of those over the next few minutes. So here's just a close-up of what some of the stuff looks like. Sorry, it's not a great photograph. I'm not even sure it's my photograph, but it gives you a sense of what this stuff looked like. And think of it as in terms of plates and bowls, maybe some serving dishes. And then the rim profiles, especially on the right-hand side, very distinctive. And it's got these grooves around the edge, which are not peculiar to Western Maryland pottery, but these are really kind of string rims. So you can take a piece of fabric or any kind of covering, drape it over the top of the pot, and then tie a string around it to keep it tight. So that's really what that's all about with these rims. The Bell potteries were another big one. These are folks, again, the Bells, Peter Bell worked for John Weiss, and so carried on a lot of those traditions. And of course, they developed too. They weren't making the same style of earthenwares decade after decade. They came up with new styles, new decorations. But you can see, I don't remember what the diameter of that circle is, but you could figure maybe a 30-mile radius out of the Hagerstown area where these pots are being sold, loaded up on wagons and hauled out to various sorts of villages throughout the area and sold, mostly probably retail. But both the Weiss and Bell potteries continued for generations. This is an example of the kind of kiln they would be using. These are fairly small scale industries. They're not industrial scale in the sense we think of today. They're not mass producing this stuff. The vessels are hand thrown on a potter's wheel, fired in a kiln like this. So you can just look at this thing, get a sense of its size. You can't get that many pots into something like this. It's an updraft kiln, so it's fueled from below. The heat rises and sinters the pots. Here's an excavated example of it's probably more of a beehive kiln, I guess you would consider this, that the folks at Washington and Lee University excavated some years ago. So same sort of principle, only it's dome shaped, it's fueled from below. The dome is perhaps more efficient in terms of distribution of the heat, so these vessels will fire more or less uniformly. A real part of the art of making pottery is firing them carefully, because if you fire them too hot or too long, they warp, and basically you have to throw them away. The glaze will kind of vaporize. They just end up looking unattractive. And also on the interior portion, which is glazed, it's glazed in part to keep liquids from being absorbed into the clay pot. If through poor firing you ruin that glaze, some of it vaporizes, exposing the underlying redware paste, that's no good. That is not going to work for you. So firing is very important. There's probably a lot of discard at these potteries, a lot of pots that just don't make it. While we were working at a site about 20 years ago, a site that I'm going to talk about, while we were working at a site up near Hagerstown, a fellow named James Smith, I think up in Chambersburg or Greencastle, right on the Pennsylvania border, was excavating one of these kilns. It was beneath a church. The corner of this really massive stone church was sitting on top of a kiln that had been abandoned long ago. Huge numbers of sherds. I wish I had taken pictures. Huge numbers and big pieces too. Let me see if I can get this to advance. There we go. These are photographs from a really good book by a guy named Gene Comstock. Gene Comstock was a dentist. He was a retired dentist who collected Great Valley earthenwares. And he took what he learned and he used his collection to publish this book, which at the time I think was $100. This is 20-odd years, 30 years ago. And partly the cost was because it was filled with color photographs. It's a really good book. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, if you can find a copy, it's certainly worth having. But I've pirated a number of images from Comstock's book. And so these earthenware plates, slipware plates are kind of typical for what these potteries are producing for use on the table. The crocks below, well, the one in the far right-hand corner is a chamber pot, but the two crocks, the pair of crocks, they're, again, they have that string rim so they can be covered and the fabric kept in place with a string. And these things were commonly used for butter pots, for pickles, and for sauerkraut, which is kind of unfortunate because butter, sauerkraut, pickles, anything like that are acidic. These earthenwares are fired at a relatively low temperature, so low that the lead glaze does not properly affix to the paste. So if you heat liquids in these pots, if you put acidic things in them, lead is leached out of the glaze and into the stuff that you expect to eat. Lead's not good for you. We've known this for a very long time. They knew in the 18th century that lead was poisonous. And in fact, a number of colonial and then state legislatures actually offered premiums, prizes for people who can come up with ways of making stonewares inexpensively, because they understood the stonewares were safe, the lead glazed redwares were not. But at any rate, these are pretty typical of the kinds of wares produced from what Comstock would call the Shenandoah Valley. For me, I consider the whole Great Valley. And in fact, I refer to these wares as mid-Atlantic slipwares because you find them from New York, even into southern New England, down through the Carolinas and further south. Mid-Atlantic slipware, I don't know if anybody else uses that term, but for me, it's kind of handy whenever we find slip decorated wares like this that are probably American made because of the context, the other kinds of wares we find them with. They're not European. It's easier to just sort of lump them all together as mid-Atlantic.
I'm going to interrupt you here for a moment.
Please.
In the chat, we have a question that says, can you define slipware?
Sure. Slipware has to do with decoration, has nothing to do with the body of the ceramic, the paste. So what you do is, there are a couple of ways of doing slipware. The simplest is to often put a sort of a base coat on the surface that you want to decorate. And then, I should have gotten a picture of this. You actually just sort of drop a line of colored clay. You mix some clay in with water, add some colorant, and then you could just trail that decoration across the ware. You can then apply lead glaze, which is usually in powder form. You just take powdered lead, one of the reasons it's dangerous, right? And you put the lead glaze on, and then you fire it, and whatever decoration you created with that line of slip is then preserved under the lead glaze. So slipware refers to a decoration, and it's usually done on red paste earthenwares. The vessels you see in front of you now, these are redwares. It's hard for me to tell from this picture, but I think they're all redwares, but they're not decorated. They're just utilitarian wares, nothing applied to them. So, the industry in Western Maryland, up and down the Great Valley, gradually switched production from red earthenwares to stonewares. New technologies for manufacturing developed. Clay deposits that are suitable for stonewares were found. Red earthenware is kind of clay you can get almost anywhere. It tends to be very rich in iron. Because it's rich in iron, when you fire it, that iron has a tendency to melt. And so if you try to fire the redwares at too high a temperature, they will warp and will be destroyed in the kiln. Stoneware clays have little or no iron. They tend to be high in magnesium and aluminum. And so they can be fired at much higher temperatures. They're also glazed not with lead, but with salt. So when the kiln is fired, it's nice and hot, you throw quantities of salt into the kiln. The salt and that great heat vaporizes and then precipitates out onto the exposed surfaces of the vessels you're firing, and will vitrify, will turn to glass. So when you look at a stoneware, you'll notice it has sort of an orange peel texture to it, this sort of dimpled surface. That's a product of salt glazing. Whereas lead glaze, if done correctly, is a nice, smooth, glassy type surface. Stoneware is a lot safer, and especially for butter pots, pickle jars, and sauerkraut, stuff like that. They're safe and they're quite useful, and you can reuse them. You just wash them and reuse them. They're also good for things like whiskey. So probably around the mid-19th century, I'm not really clear on the dates anymore, but around the mid-19th century and after the Civil War, redwares were really phasing out. And maybe as early as the second quarter of the 19th century, stoneware started to take over the market in terms of ceramic products. After the Civil War, a new vessel material comes out, two actually, that are very effective, inexpensive to produce, and are effectively disposable. That is tin cans, actually steel, not tin, and glass. So when we're out in the field, we're finding sites that have a lot of glass on them. Chances are they date to after the Civil War, to the point where by the late 19th, early 20th century, the kinds of historic sites we find are just loaded with vessel glass. And redwares are virtually absent. Stonewares show up in small numbers, and they're the kind of American stonewares you'll see typically in antique stores today. What the industry did in Western Maryland was, because they lost the redware market and they were losing the stoneware market too, again, because glass and steel became the preferred container materials, they kept their potteries open by making what are essentially novelties. And that's what you see here, especially that lion in the lower right-hand corner. Obviously has no function whatsoever. It's meant to be decorative. And the sort of oval piece in the middle, bottom, as I recall, is a picture frame or a mirror frame. Has an American eagle at the top. These are the kinds of things they're producing for local markets, the kind of knickknacks. And even the vessels you see, the vases and everything, those are largely made as kitsch, as knickknacks. In the far upper right-hand corner, you see those two pots. Those things are still being made to a limited extent, bean pots and pickle jars and such. So that's the nature of the industry. In the 18th century, after the French and Indian War, and into, say, the second quarter of the 19th century, redwares are common, get a lot of these slipwares. Then they kind of move it over into stonewares, eventually into these novelty wares, and then they're out of business. Most of these potteries didn't make it past, say, the 1920s. And certainly the Great Depression would have eliminated a lot. That said, potteries continued and do continue down south in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. There's still strong stoneware potting traditions. There's probably some in Maryland too, but none I can think of offhand. So anyway, that's what's out there, what's being produced. Now I want to talk about the Rife site in Sear Foss in Washington County. Sear Foss is a crossroads hamlet about 5 miles, perhaps northwest of Hagerstown, just a mile or two south of the Pennsylvania border. It's the kind of place you would, you sneeze while you drive and you're going to miss it. We were there, let's see, I guess probably maybe 1995. We were there excavating the site that I'd found during a survey. because the State Highway Administration was going to put in a traffic circle, a roundabout. And they eventually did. And this site was going to be in the way. So here's a map. I think this is the Taggart map, of 1857. So this is the general area. This is a lovely map. I know Ray is gritting his teeth here because this is one of those maps, a subscription map of the period that is relatively unusual because it actually has property boundaries on it. You can see the individual farms. And Ray will attest to the difficulty of trying to reconstruct these things from deeds, from surveyors' descriptions and meets and bounds, and trying to assemble them like a puzzle on a modern map. It's quite challenging. Well, here in this area in 1857, they made one. So it's very handy. You can see Hagerstown in the lower right-hand corner. And then Searfoss is, if you could see my mouse, just left of the uppermost center, just a little crossroads. And here's a detail of it. At the time, in 1857, it was referred to as Cunningham's Crossroads. Before that, it was called, I think it was just called Zeller's Crossroads for Jacob Zeller. But the left-hand map shows you the area in 1807, I think, 1808. So you could see it's really a tavern stand. It's a crossroads near the Conococheague Creek. It's on roads that lead from Western Maryland towards Eastern Maryland, particularly Baltimore, and that lead north-south into Pennsylvania and Virginia. So it's an important crossroads community. And even Hagerstown, by the mid-19th century was becoming a similar crossroads, not only for turnpikes, but for railroad traffic. So it was a very busy commercial area. Jacob Zeller owned much of this. The patent was called the New Republic. He owned it, and then it came into a succession of hands that were all really related. I think I have the chain in the next slide. But this is our reconstruction of plats of the area, just trying to figure out who was living where. And you can see just below the number 3 on the right-hand side of the Williamsport Greencastle Turnpike, this is where the archaeological site is, where the Rife site is located. Here's a view of Searfoss in 1877, Crossroads Hamlets. Again, you can see all these names, including Daniel Searfoss, and there's a toll house here. Daniel Searfoss essentially owns that whole intersection there. And his in-laws, George Cunningham, owns across the road. But here's a succession of owners. George Mayer in 1795, Samuel Spickler, he gets in 1798, his son inherits it in 1838. John Cunningham, for which the place becomes Cunningham's Corner, is known for named for him. He acquires it because his wife Mary is a Spickler, and so she inherited from I think her brother Samuel Jr. And then John Cunningham died, and Mary Spickler Cunningham married Daniel Searfoss. So the land is conveying through the same kind of family, through marriages, through Mary, and eventually is acquired by Daniel Searfoss, Daniel and Mary's children. A simplified map, here it is, Rife site right here at this intersection. We know there was a tavern lot across the road, and there's a building there which I suspect was the tavern, at least in the 19th century. Directly across the road, there was a blacksmith shop. We know that. Right now, it's a convenience store. It was a terrible place to work, this site right here, because every morning at 9:30 at the convenience store, they'd start frying chicken. And so the air would be redolent with melted chicken fat. It was just nasty. Also, these two turnpikes. They're very narrow roads, but they're incredibly busy. Huge amount of traffic, particularly coming down the Greencastle Pike. And here we have a group of people working right alongside the road. Greencastle Pike, as you head north on it towards the top of the page, it climbs this fairly steep hill. So if you're heading south out of Pennsylvania down Greencastle Pike, you come to the top of this hill, and all of a sudden you start going down a steep hill towards this tiny intersection. And there are a lot of semi trucks coming through there. It was pretty wild, horns blowing all the time. No accidents, surprisingly enough, but people kept rubbernecking. You know, what are those people doing, digging alongside the road? Amazing, none of us got killed. So anyway, right side archaeology. Here's our crew. Black and white photograph. It was a while ago. You see this, I think this was the tavern site, one of the taverns just across the street. We have a number of people in here who probably are no longer with us. Al Lavish, Spencer Giese, and Denise. I don't remember Denise's last name offhand, but here we are doing some excavations. And in the background, right alongside the road without any barrier whatsoever, we have two young people excavating. Society doesn't have as much invested in them, so we can put them in a riskier position. Although one might argue that the older guys who are collecting Social Security, you know, maybe they should be closer to the road. I don't know who this is on the left, but on the right is Tara Pettit, who has worked with me for several years. You can see how close they are to the road. The interesting thing about this site, one of the interesting things is that we found it doing some shovel testing for the State Highway Administration wanted to put a roundabout. And my conclusion at the time was, well, there's a site here. It's first half of the 19th century probably, but it's really been boogered up and has no value. And so the State Highway sent me back and said, go do a phase 2 on it. So I did a phase 2 on it where we did some excavation units. And I came back and said, this site is all boogered up. It has no value. And they said, well, go back and do some more phase 2 excavation, which we did. We came back and said, this site has no value. It's been too boogered up. And they finally sent us back to do an excavation of it, a salvage excavation of phase 3. My conclusion after the end of the phase 3 was this site has no value. It's all been boogered up. But if it has any value at all, it's all the ceramics we got out of it. That's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the site. Just one more view of us excavating. There's the offending convenience store across the street. It looks like polo masks there. Obviously, this was in winter, and folks are kind of covered up. It's hard for me to see who's who, although that might be me. So here's our excavation. You remember, here's the, we got one road here, one road over here. We did a bunch of shovel tests. That's what all these little circles are about. We did a bunch of excavation units, which you can see here. And running through the area was a water line, a major water line, which is one of the reasons the site was so boogered up. And over here on the right, I dare anybody to sort all of this out. There's so much bedrock out there and deteriorating stone. It was really hard to distinguish what might have been foundation from what was just natural bedrock and stone in the soil. That area is very stony limestone soil. And at any rate, we think we found part of a foundation. But again, as I've mentioned once or twice before, the site's boogered up. It's been graded over, a water line put through it. It was a flea market on weekends for many years. It was pretty well beat up. And so we really didn't expect to find much in the way of structural remains, specifically foundation. But here you can see, if we put the units together, and a sense of what the soil profile looked like. We have stratum 1, which is a recently developed topsoil. Stratum 2, which had most of the cultural material in it, all mixed together. And stratum 3, which had a little bit, was basically getting down into subsoil. So here's some of the stuff we found. This is back in the old days when we did everything with pen and ink instead of computer simulations. But these are partial vessels, they're bowls, where we didn't have most of the stuff is broken up quite a bit and incomplete. So in most cases, we didn't have a rim to base profile. So we don't know what the bottom of the vessel looks like, but we could certainly reconstruct the upper part of the vessel. And we do that, if you look at the far left-hand side, by making a tracing of what that rim profile looks like. We use various sorts of measuring devices to figure out the diameter. And let's say this has an 8-inch diameter. Well, we can, on graph paper, we've got this drawn. We can draw a straight line that's 8 inches across, find a center at 4 inches, and then draw light lines across that help us reconstruct, and then stipple a lot to show texture and shadow and whatnot. And that's how we used to reconstruct these things on paper. Some examples of those slip decorated plates, the better preserved pieces. So you can see, the squiggly line kind of, colored slip underneath the lead glaze. It's not representational. There are no zoomorphic or anthropomorphic or landscape views or architecture or anything like that. But you can see how these might be slightly garish way. I mean, if it's folk art, these could be quite attractive, and that's why they've been collected for many years. And you probably can't. Most of us probably couldn't afford to buy them now. I'm sure they're extraordinarily expensive. But these are plates that would have been used on the table at this particular site. This is an example of one of those slip decorated wares where, let me go back one first. You could see this, certainly the top vessel here, we've got the rim. You could see we probably have the base here, the foot ring of the vessel. So as long as we have that much, we can reconstruct this thing in 3 dimensions, and that's what we've got here. Actually, with a computer, we can turn this into a 3-dimensional image. And we've got the base to rim profile of a pan, which could have been used for butter making, could have been made for cooking, possibly used for serving. You can see a lot of breaks, a lot of gluing. You'll notice these little white tags. This is, on each of those, resolution isn't good enough in the picture, but each of these has the site number and it has the lot number. So we can connect each sherd to the digital catalog we have for the site. So we were doing this back in the mid-90s. The state just approved this kind of labeling technique about 3 or 4 years ago. We print out the labels and affix them with acrylic that artists use for glazing paintings. It's all quite safe. But here you could see these rim profiles I showed you earlier, the string rims, and oops, that's what we have here, same sort of rim. And there's variation depending on who the potter is and when it was made. We have a number of these pots, and these are basically butter pots and sauerkraut pots. Always lead glazed on the interior, again, because you don't want whey from the butter seeping into the clay, because once it does that, it's going to become rancid. Same thing with sauerkraut and pickles. You want to keep those juices in the pot, because if they start evaporating out through the fabric of the pot, your pickles and your sauerkraut are going to get left high and dry. This is actually a stoneware pot, what we think was made locally. It's hard to get a sense of a slip on it as well, but it is salt glazed or alkaline glazed. Some of the other things we found there, these are not locally made. Most of the vessels I'll show you over the next few slides, they're made in the Midlands of England. And yet they appear in the same deposits as those locally made slipwares. So we have a blue-edged plate. These are classic early to mid 19th century ceramic types, decorative types. You see them on all kinds of sites in that period. Mocha wares or dipped wares. Transfer prints, again on a whiteware. So this stuff is probably around the second quarter of the 19th century, 1825, 1850 range. This kind of stuff is really important to find on an archaeological site because it's got scenes. This is probably supposed to be vaguely Turkish or Ottoman Empire, judging from what I can see here. Why did they pick that particular design? Did that design speak to them? Why don't they have a landscape or one with Gothic churches or Tuscan villas? People had their choice of what decorated wares they could buy. They selected this, and on a better preserved site, maybe we can make something of what these folks were thinking when they bought that. But again, they were using these as well as slip decorated earthenwares. Yeah, this is an example of a Gothic design. If you could see, and these are two from the same set, but you could see a Gothic church in that view. What do you suppose that means? Well, this is a period of religious awakenings, as they were called, a great deal of religiosity spreading across the American landscape. Camp meetings were becoming big, and for rural life, if you didn't belong to a church, you were kind of out of it socially. So perhaps this says something about that. And more, kind of benign, sort of, I guess these are supposed to be strawberries, painted whiteware. Probably maybe even some sort of dessert dish. So anyway, that's it for the pictures. So here are the questions that we need to deal with, or as archaeologists we like to deal with. And is, why did the Searfoss family and other people in the area, because we find those locally made earthenwares all over the place, as well as the Staffordshire ceramics, why did they persist in buying these locally made wares while also buying imported wares? We don't know the relative cost. We don't know if one was cheaper than the other. We do know that in the grand scheme of things, ceramics are pretty inexpensive. So relative cost probably was not at issue. But there's something about the different styles of wares that appeal to people in different ways. And we don't have any answers for this. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. We need to look at a lot of sites in that area, preferably those that were occupied for short periods of time and that are better preserved than this Rife site. But are there differences in wear types, forms, and decorations? Well, we know we've got plates from Staffordshire, and we have plates that are made locally. We have locally made pots. We don't have imported pots, not from the UK anyway. It's interesting that the use, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we found the remains of a lot of essentially butter pots and sauerkraut pots on the site. So people persisted in buying those locally, using them for butter and other foods. And it looks like they stopped buying the local tablewares and went in for the European imports. Now, it doesn't matter where they come from. These vessels, they serve the same purposes. We make plates and pots in Western Maryland. We make plates and pots in Midlands of England. So there's something more. It's not just, you're not looking for something that performs a different function. But there's something ideological about this, something that speaks to folks. The problem with the Rife site is, again, because it is, as I've mentioned once or twice before, is boogered up. We don't have nice stratigraphy. We can't separate different occupations. The occupation of the site probably throughout the first half of the 19th century, all that stuff is mixed together. And it's not a very long period of time, but it's a period of time in which significant events occurred, and there might have been significant changes in families and, cultures they come from. Were they Mennonites? Were they kind of German Lutherans? Were they Protestants, English Protestants living on that site? We don't know. Other questions, what became of the local potteries? Well, that's pretty easy to answer, mostly through Gene Comstock's book, is that most of them closed down eventually, again, by the 1920s, most well before that. They did adapt to market demands. Again, they made more and more in the way of pots for storing foods and eventually stonewares. There are some that are still around, although probably not direct descendants of potteries I mentioned. But I don't know of any in Western Maryland. There may well be some. But certainly, again, as you head south through the Great Valley, there are strong stoneware potting traditions. These places are still, they're open to the public, and I'm sure they do demonstrations, and of course they sell their wares. So in some ways, the industry continues, but not as far as I know locally. Anyway, that's about all I have for this evening. Happy to entertain questions.
Jim, this is Steve Israel, did you get any indication when the period of destruction started happening on the Rife site?
It's hard to say because it was at an intersection, a very busy intersection, been busy since forever. So probably a lot of things happened there. But the most significant destruction certainly was with the water line. And I don't remember when that was. It's in my report. It's probably, as always, there's a publication.
Yes.
To these talks. It's in Maryland Archaeology some years back. But a water main went through probably 1970s, 1980s. I don't remember the date. And that would have caused, because you have to, you're grading off, then you're digging a really big trench. I think it was close to 10 feet wide. So that probably caused a lot of damage.
Yes.
And then it was sort of a parking lot where they'd have a flea market on weekends. So I'm sure that caused its share of destruction too. So now the thing is, as badly as it's destroyed, you could see a large ceramic collection. By working with this material, I've come up with some questions, some ideas. We can then go to other sites in the area that are not badly disturbed, and we can start exploring some of those questions, developing some new ones. I think there's some interesting archaeology to be done on just the ceramic choice issue, just waiting for it to happen. The limitation is that none of the Western Maryland, well, with the exception of the city of Frederick, none of the Western jurisdictions have archaeological review as part of their subdivision regulation. And so lots of these sites get bulldozed. We don't know, we have no idea how many, but without an archaeologist ever looking at them, as opposed to counties like Charles, Prince George's, and Anne Arundel County, where we have archaeological review, and in many cases, such sites would be caught here and are caught. Problem is, as far as Western Maryland, mid-Atlantic slipwares go, they're uncommon around here.
With a lot of traffic at the crossroads and a lot of neighbors, there were a lot of neighbors with different values, different experiences, which allowed the new ceramics to come in.
That's true. Now, I will say that while we were working there, a local farmer made mention of finding similar stuff on his farm. So I actually, went over there for an hour or so one day, and that farm was not at an intersection. I didn't do any digging, but it looked like the deposits probably were reasonably intact. And a few areas where the ground had been disturbed, yeah, sure enough, there were Great Valley earthenwares coming out of the ground. So, I mean, there are lots of sites that could be investigated up there that are not subject or have not been subjected to the same disregard, hence the Rife site had been. But
So-
again, we worked on the site, we found a bunch of stuff, we came up with some ideas, now we can go check them out in better places.
So there is value with the historical questions that you have raised.
Yeah. Even though the site itself, in my opinion, still isn't worth anything.
Exactly.
Yeah, I prefer to work on sites where they're in good shape and we stand some chance of, actually learning something. Any other questions? Any of you plan on being in Western Maryland anytime soon? Because if you are, keep your eyes open, look at the ground, see what's coming out. Again, it'd be interesting to see where these things are popping up, see potential archaeological sites that we can work on. Okay, there being nothing else, we'll cut it short today. I hope everybody has a good summer, and I hope to see you all back in September.